In September of 1990, the town of Marlow Ridge, Missouri, awoke to an unsettling discovery. 28-year-old Karen Delaney had failed to return home after her night shift at the local diner. Karen was known for her reliability. She rarely missed work, and she maintained a quiet routine that neighbors recognized. Her absence was noticed early in the morning by Lydia Marsh, a close friend who also worked at the diner. Marsh grew concerned when Karen's porch light remained on, and her car was not in the driveway. The police arrived quickly, assessing the scene at Karen's small, single-story home. Nothing appeared forcibly entered. Doors were locked, windows intact, and the house itself seemed undisturbed. Minimal signs of struggle were present. No items were missing, no valuables taken. The peculiar nature of the scene immediately created confusion among responding officers. Among the few pieces of evidence collected, a smudged fingerprint on the back door stood out. It did not match Karen Delaney or anyone known to investigators at the time. Detective Paul Renner, assigned to the case, carefully documented every detail. The living room, the kitchen, the back door, all were photographed and measured. Officers collected a small sample of fibers and dust from the floor near the entry point. Despite thorough documentation, no clear explanation for the entry existed. The fingerprint remained the single anomaly, ambiguous yet persistent, a detail that would later become central to solving the case. Throughout the night, investigators interviewed neighbors who recalled hearing minimal noise. A car door had closed late in the evening. Some residents mentioned seeing a shadow near the back fence. Each account conflicted slightly with the others, creating an initial mosaic of uncertainty. Investigators logged each statement, cross-referencing times and locations. Even minor contradictions were noted and preserved for potential analysis. By morning, the scene had been thoroughly examined, yet questions lingered. How had someone entered the home without force? Why was nothing taken? How did Karen Delaney's life end so abruptly in a place so familiar? Officers left the house with files full of evidence and reports full of questions. The fingerprint, carefully bagged and stored, remained the most enigmatic clue. Over the following weeks, detectives attempted to identify the print. It was compared against local and state databases. No match emerged. The trail appeared cold, frustrating in its silence. For those close to Karen, each passing day without resolution deepened concern and unease. Small-town residents whispered about the night quietly, unsure what could explain it. The unanswered questions defined the case for decades. Karen Delaney's life, routine, and habits became pieces of a puzzle that had no solution at the time. The fingerprint, nearly forgotten in a storage drawer, awaited technology that would one day reveal its significance. The case file remained open but stagnant. The town moved on, carrying a faint awareness of an unresolved loss. This initial investigation set the tone for what would remain, for many years, a cold, unresolved case. Yet, decades later, that smudged fingerprint would reappear under the lens of new forensic technology. It would link Karen Delaney's death to a man long overlooked, changing everything investigators once believed. The story of that night, frozen in time, would finally begin to make sense. Marlow Ridge, Missouri, in 1990, was a town of just over 3,000 people. It had a quiet rhythm, with a main street lined by small shops and a diner that operated late into the night. The town's residents were familiar with one another. Families had lived there for generations. The local high school and church were central to social life. This small-town atmosphere created an environment where everyone believed they knew their neighbors well. Karen Delaney fit seamlessly into the town. She was 28, lived alone, and had a reputation for responsibility and attentiveness. Co-workers at the diner described her as soft-spoken and reliable. She maintained a modest routine, working evenings, grocery shopping in the early mornings, and occasionally visiting friends on weekends. Her quiet presence made her a familiar figure in Marlow Ridge, someone people assumed they could always count on. Neighbors recall Karen walking along narrow streets, often with a bag of groceries or a book in hand. She frequently greeted passers-by, nodding politely but without lingering. These small actions, though ordinary, reinforced the impression of stability and predictability. To those around her, Karen Delaney represented the reliability that made small-town life feel secure. Her apartment, a modest single-story home on Maple Lane, reflected her habits. It was neat, organized, and uncluttered. She maintained a small garden at the front, cared for her porch light, and left few personal items visible from the outside. Her routine created a sense of normalcy that, after her disappearance, only underscored the strangeness of the circumstances. The diner where she worked was central to the town's social rhythm. Patrons knew Karen by name, recognizing her meticulous work ethic. She often stayed past closing to help clean or organize. On the night she disappeared, she left at 10:15 p.m., a time typical for her shifts. Security footage captured her walking across the lot to her car. Nothing in her behavior suggested she anticipated danger or suspicion. Residents described the period following her disappearance as quiet but tense. Conversations included cautious speculation, yet no concrete leads emerged. Karen's absence was felt throughout Marlow Ridge. Friends, co-workers, and neighbors noticed her routines broken. Despite the town's close-knit nature, no immediate explanations appeared. The community's calm was shadowed by uncertainty and unanswered questions. The combination of Karen Delaney's reliability and the town's predictability highlighted the stark contrast of her sudden disappearance. Everything appeared ordinary until that night. The familiarity of Marlow Ridge, the predictable rhythms of daily life, and Karen's consistent habits all underscored how unusual the events of September 14, 1990, truly were. Through recollections from neighbors and co-workers, a detailed portrait of Karen Delaney emerges. Her daily patterns, interactions, and presence within the town provide context to the investigation. Understanding both the town and the woman at its center is essential for grasping why her disappearance became a case that would linger unsolved for decades. The next chapter focuses on the hours between Karen Delaney leaving the diner and the discovery of her absence. Those moments, recorded by neighbors, security footage, and police reports, form a timeline critical to understanding the case. It is within this narrow window that the questions multiply and the mystery deepens. On the evening of September 14, 1990, Karen Delaney finished her shift at the diner at 10:15 p.m. Security footage shows her walking steadily to her car, carrying her purse. The parking lot was quiet. A few late patrons remained inside the diner, but the lot itself was nearly empty. Karen followed her usual route, taking care not to rush. By approximately 10:40 p.m., a neighbor reported hearing a car door close. The sound was ordinary, consistent with a resident returning home. No one observed anything overtly unusual. The timeline between 10:15 and 10:40 establishes a narrow window during which events leading to Karen Delaney's death occurred. Investigators carefully noted each timestamp, ensuring every second was accounted for. Morning brought concern when Karen had not returned home. Her porch light remained on. Her car was absent from the driveway. Her purse remained inside the house. Lydia Marsh, her friend and co-worker, arrived at 7:30 a.m. and noticed these irregularities. She attempted to call Karen but received no response. When the phone remained unanswered, Marsh contacted local authorities, prompting the initial police response. Police officers arrived and conducted a detailed assessment. They measured and photographed the front and back doors, the living room, and the surrounding yard. Officers examined entry points and noted a partially smudged fingerprint on the back door. No other fingerprints, aside from Karen's own, were visible. The fingerprint did not match any known residents or previously entered records. Its origin remained unknown. Neighbors' recollections were logged. Some reported seeing a figure near the back fence. Others heard minimal noise, though no alarms were triggered. Statements were cross-referenced against the known schedule of Karen Delaney. Every minor contradiction and observation was documented. Officers created a detailed timeline, including departures, arrivals, and auditory accounts. Detective Paul Renner coordinated the effort, reviewing the evening's security footage and neighbor reports. He mapped each minute between the diner and Karen's home. No footprints suggested forced entry. The back door, where the fingerprint was found, could only be opened from the inside or with a key. Investigators considered every possibility: accidental lockouts, brief intrusions, or an unseen visitor. None fit the available evidence completely. The evidence from these vanishing hours was sparse, yet significant. It created a puzzle with few pieces, each critical to understanding what happened. Investigators recognized the need for precise documentation. Even minor observations could provide context decades later when technology might allow re-examination of the fingerprint. This timeline, though incomplete, forms the foundation for understanding the investigation that followed. It establishes the parameters of the event and frames the mystery in clear, verifiable terms. The following chapter will explore the first investigation, detailing methods, interviews, and procedures as the case moved forward. Detective Paul Renner led the initial investigation following Karen Delaney's disappearance. He was 34 years old, experienced in small-town cases, and meticulous in documenting evidence. Upon arrival, Renner coordinated the officers and ensured the collection of all physical evidence. Every room in Karen Delaney's single-story home was photographed, measured, and logged. Fibers from the living room carpet, dust from the kitchen counters, and the smudged fingerprint on the back door were collected and sealed. Evidence tags were attached and documented in the case file. Officers interviewed neighbors. One resident recalled a figure near the back fence around 10:45 p.m. Another heard the faint sound of footsteps, but could not specify direction or number of people. Statements were recorded carefully, including any discrepancies. Investigators also canvassed the town to identify anyone who might have been in the area. Routine records were checked, including vehicle registrations and employment logs. Each detail was preserved for potential follow-up. Detective Renner spoke with co-workers and friends of Karen Delaney. Interviews focused on her last known movements, habits, and interactions. Friends described her as responsible, careful, and cautious. No threats or disputes were reported. The investigation included reviewing security footage from the diner. It confirmed Karen's routine departure at 10:15 p.m., walking to her car along the rear lot. Nothing appeared unusual in her behavior on that night. Police investigated known associates, including an ex-boyfriend and a delivery driver who had been seen near Karen Delaney's home. Neither individual had any criminal record linking them to the disappearance. Interviews did not produce incriminating statements. The fingerprint lifted from the back door did not match either person. Authorities compared it to the local fingerprint database and state records, but found no matches. It remained an unidentified anomaly. Detective Renner maintained careful chain of custody procedures. Every evidence item was logged with date, time, and collector's name. Samples were sealed and stored at the county evidence locker. Laboratory processing was limited in 1990. The partial fingerprint could not be conclusively identified with existing technology. Fiber analysis and dust samples were preserved for future review. The lack of forensic matches contributed to the initial stagnation of the case. Weeks turned into months. Routine follow-up calls and interviews produced little new information. Detective Renner and his team revisited statements, cross-checked alibis, and re-examined the property for overlooked clues. Nothing resolved the central paradox: how Karen Delaney's house had been accessed without force, leaving no trace except the single fingerprint. Community concern persisted, but the trail ran cold. The first investigation established a detailed record. It documented what was known and preserved what could not be explained. The fingerprint, stored carefully in the evidence box, became a potential key for future technology. Detective Renner and the officers left the scene with clear documentation, ensuring that decades later, new methods could re-examine the evidence without loss of integrity. Though unresolved, the case remained open. Karen Delaney's absence was noted, the fingerprint preserved, and the investigative groundwork laid. This first attempt created a baseline that would later allow forensic advancements to reinterpret the facts. The following chapter will explore the years of silence and the community memory that kept the case alive. Following the initial investigation, the case of Karen Delaney grew quiet. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Marlow Ridge continued its routine, but the absence of resolution weighed on those connected to the incident. Families continued daily life, businesses remained open, and the diner where Karen had worked changed ownership. The story of her disappearance became part of the town's collective memory, referenced occasionally, but gradually fading from active discussion. Karen's sister, Ellen Delaney, moved to Kansas City, but maintained a close connection to her sister's memory. Each September 14th, she visited Karen's grave, reflecting on the unresolved questions. Friends and co-workers occasionally spoke of Karen's habits and routines. Memories were shared quietly, often in the context of general conversation rather than investigation. The community retained a vague awareness, but details became less precise with time. Local law enforcement revisited the case periodically. Cold case units reviewed the file, noting the preserved fingerprint, photographs, and witness statements. Every few years, investigative officers would re-examine the evidence for leads. Despite thorough review, the absence of a match for the fingerprint prevented progress. These reviews produced minor procedural updates, but the central mystery persisted. Technological limitations defined this period. In 1990, fingerprint analysis relied on manual comparison and limited databases. Partial prints, such as the one collected at Karen Delaney's home, often could not be resolved. Fiber and dust samples were preserved in evidence storage but could not yield definitive results. Any potential suspects identified by neighborhood accounts remained unconfirmed due to insufficient evidence. Ellen Delaney corresponded with law enforcement, submitting questions, requests for updates, and reminders about the fingerprint. Detective Paul Renner, who retired in the early 2000s, continued to track the file when possible. The preservation of evidence and documentation was critical, ensuring that any future technological improvements could be applied without loss. During this period, the Marlow Ridge community continued to function normally. Residents occasionally recalled the case in conversations or when referencing the diner where Karen had worked. The story was never forgotten entirely, but it receded from the daily focus of law enforcement and the broader public. The town's awareness existed as quiet background memory, a faint but persistent acknowledgement of unresolved loss. By 2018, the Missouri Cold Case Task Force began a systematic review of unsolved homicides. Files, evidence, and documentation from decades prior were re-examined using modern forensic techniques. In Karen Delaney's case, the fingerprint that had long resisted identification was placed under new scrutiny. Task force members noted its potential significance, anticipating that updated technology might provide answers where earlier efforts had failed. The years of silence established context for the case. Community memory, careful preservation of evidence, and detailed investigative notes created the conditions necessary for eventual breakthroughs. Though the case appeared dormant for decades, the fingerprint, evidence chain, and record-keeping ensured that Karen Delaney's story could be revisited with new tools and insight. This period of silence underscored both the limitations of past technology and the importance of patience. It demonstrated the enduring role of documentation, the value of preserving evidence, and the capacity for modern forensic science to eventually illuminate previously unresolved events. The following chapter focuses on the examination of the fingerprint and the lead that emerged decades later. In 2018, Missouri's Cold Case Task Force reviewed the file on Karen Delaney's disappearance. A newly trained forensic technician, Maya Holloway, was assigned to examine the preserved fingerprint found on the back door. Modern software allowed microfragment comparison and digital enhancement, which were unavailable in 1990. The print was scanned and entered into the statewide database. This represented a significant advancement in the analysis process, enabling higher precision than was previously possible. The scan revealed a potential match. Within hours, the system identified a fingerprint belonging to Raymond Keller, a maintenance worker who had been arrested in 2005 for a nonviolent offense. Keller resided in a town approximately 15 miles from Marlow Ridge. Task force analysts reviewed employment records and personal history, confirming Keller had been active in the area at the time of Karen Delaney's disappearance. The fingerprint, previously unidentified, now suggested a concrete lead. Investigators reviewed Keller's work history. In 1990, he maintained vending machines in multiple locations, including the diner where Karen Delaney worked. His schedule aligned with her shifts that week. Records indicated he accessed areas in close proximity to Karen's home. Initial interviews conducted decades earlier revealed only limited questioning of Keller. At the time, investigators had no conclusive evidence linking him to the scene. Maya Holloway conducted multiple verification scans. Each attempt confirmed the match. The system estimated a 94% likelihood that the fingerprint belonged to Keller. Analysts documented the procedures carefully, ensuring all digital records, chain of custody forms, and metadata were preserved. The new evidence was formally submitted to the county sheriff's office, where detectives began reviewing the implications for reopening the case. Detective Paul Renner, now retired, was informed of the potential match. His response reflected measured skepticism tempered by curiosity. He reviewed the original notes, photographs, and the fingerprint itself, The match between the preserved print and Keller's record represented a breakthrough that had been impossible under the investigative capabilities of 1990. The combination of meticulous preservation and advanced technology created an opportunity to resolve the case decades after it went cold. Authorities conducted preliminary interviews with Keller to establish contact. They confirmed he had access to the diner and nearby locations during the relevant period. Investigators began mapping his movements, cross-referencing statements, and reviewing employment logs. The fingerprints served as the central piece connecting him to the timeline of Karen Delaney's disappearance. Each verification step was carefully recorded, ensuring admissibility in future proceedings. The re-examination of the fingerprint demonstrated the power of forensic advancements. Evidence once considered inconclusive became pivotal. It illustrated the value of preserving minute details, even those initially deemed insignificant. The case, dormant for nearly 30 years, now had a tangible lead that could reshape the understanding of events. The discovery prompted the sheriff's office to prioritize the reopening of Karen Delaney's case. Analysts compiled reports, coordinated interviews, and initiated surveillance of Keller's current residence. The fingerprint, a smudged trace preserved for decades, had finally revealed its significance. Investigators were positioned to reconstruct the past, translating decades-old observations into actionable insight. This breakthrough marked a turning point in the investigation. What had been a cold, unresolved case now had a measurable lead. The following chapter examines the reconstruction of Keller's movements, interviews, and the narrowing of potential explanations for Karen Delaney's disappearance. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline of Raymond Keller's activities in September 1990. Employment records confirmed Keller worked part-time maintaining vending machines, including units located at the diner where Karen Delaney was employed. His schedule coincided with her shifts, placing him in proximity to her home during the hours leading up to her disappearance. Each log entry was verified, cross-referenced with bank transactions and vehicle records, ensuring accuracy. Detectives reviewed the original 1990 interviews with Keller. At that time, he was questioned briefly but released due to lack of conclusive evidence. No fingerprints matched, and witness statements were inconclusive. Investigators compared those earlier accounts with modern records, noting discrepancies in his recollection of locations and times. These inconsistencies, while subtle, suggested the need for further examination. Neighborhood accounts were revisited. Residents who had reported seeing figures near Karen Delaney's home in 1990 were re-interviewed to verify details. Some recollections remained consistent with prior statements. Others clarified minor details previously ambiguous. Each account was logged and compared to Keller's work schedule and known movements. Investigators looked for overlapping data points that could triangulate his presence near the home. Forensic evidence from the original investigation was reanalyzed. The fingerprint collected from the back door remained central. Dust samples and fibers were cross-checked with Keller's known belongings where possible. While many materials had degraded over time, preserved evidence provided confirmation that Keller had touched surfaces within Karen Delaney's home. Analysts documented each correlation carefully, creating a reconstruction that integrated decades-old observation with modern verification. Detective Paul Renner, though retired, contributed insights from the original case files. He highlighted inconsistencies between statements, physical evidence, and local accounts. These observations guided the team in prioritizing interviews and examining secondary evidence. Every minor detail, from a misplaced key to a time-stamped maintenance log, was used to build a precise sequence of events. Investigators noted Keller's proximity to the diner, the home, and surrounding streets. They mapped his movements against the vanishing hours of Karen Delaney. Access points to her home were examined, and security measures present in 1990 were considered. Keller's access as a maintenance worker provided plausible explanations for movement without raising immediate suspicion. Investigators documented each step, ensuring logical continuity. Interviews with Keller in 2019 were conducted carefully. He appeared calm, providing vague answers about locations and activities. Investigators cross-checked statements with historical records. Subtle contradictions emerged. While not initially incriminating, these inconsistencies, combined with the fingerprint and employment logs, created a pattern suggesting involvement in Karen Delaney's death. Each observation was cataloged systematically. The reconstructed past provided clarity on what had once seemed impossible. By aligning schedules, movements, witness statements, and preserved evidence, investigators created a coherent timeline. Keller's presence and proximity to Karen Delaney's home became undeniable. This methodical approach transformed the case from decades-old speculation into a fact-based narrative, ready for further action. This reconstruction formed the basis for the next stage of the investigation, confirming the connection between Keller and Karen Delaney, narrowing suspects, and preparing for legal proceedings. The following chapter details the arrest, confession, and community response that followed this breakthrough. In 2020, authorities executed a formal arrest of Raymond Keller based on the verified fingerprint and corroborating evidence. The county sheriff's office coordinated with Missouri's cold case task force to ensure all procedures adhered to current legal standards. Keller was informed of the charges, and officers carefully documented every step to maintain chain of custody and procedural integrity. The arrest was unpublicized initially. Investigators prioritized confirming evidence and reviewing all related case files. Fingerprint verification, employment history, and reconstructed timelines formed the basis of the formal charging documents. Each item was meticulously cross-referenced. Keller's prior interviews and minor inconsistencies were included as part of the record. Investigators aimed for clarity and accuracy rather than sensationalism. Upon arrest, Keller was cooperative but remained vague regarding his actions in September 1990. He denied intentional wrongdoing initially, providing limited details. Investigators compared his statements with historical data, noting contradictions between his recollections and the original reports. These inconsistencies, when combined with fingerprint evidence and employment logs, created a strong case for prosecution. Detective Paul Renner, attending in an advisory role, reviewed the progress with the task force. He reflected on the meticulous preservation of evidence and the evolution of forensic technology. The fingerprint, once unresolved, had provided a conclusive link decades after the event. Renner emphasized the value of procedural thoroughness in enabling justice, even after significant time had passed. Legal counsel coordinated with the sheriff's office to ensure that all statements and confessions were properly documented. Investigators verified the chain of custody for every physical item, including the fingerprint sample, dust collection, and fiber evidence. Each procedural step was completed with care to avoid errors that could compromise the case. Over subsequent weeks, Keller provided additional statements. Under careful questioning, he acknowledged the confrontation with Karen Delaney, explaining that an argument over unpaid repairs escalated, resulting in her accidental death. He admitted that in panic, he attempted to obscure details, but evidence from the scene preserved in 1990 contradicted selective claims. Investigators recorded the statements verbatim, ensuring consistency with prior records. News of the case spread quietly through Marlow Ridge. Community response was subdued but reflective. Residents expressed relief that the long unresolved mystery was addressed. Family members, particularly Ellen Delaney, expressed gratitude for the diligent investigation while acknowledging the enduring impact of the event. Candlelight vigils and memorials were organized, honoring Karen Delaney without sensationalist display. The arrest and confession brought closure to decades of uncertainty. The combination of preserved evidence, technological advancement, and systematic reconstruction had resolved a case previously thought cold. While the incident could not undo the past, justice was formally recognized. The procedural and factual approach emphasized accountability and ethical handling of sensitive historical events. This stage of the investigation concluded the active legal process. Evidence had been verified, suspects identified, and statements collected under lawful procedures. Community reflection, family acknowledgement, and law enforcement diligence combined to create a sense of resolution. The following chapter explores the long-term impact and continuity of investigative work within the community. In the aftermath of the case resolution, Marlow Ridge reflected on the enduring significance of Karen Delaney's story. The town marked September 14th with quiet remembrance. Candlelight vigils were held, attended by family, friends, and residents who remembered her presence in the community. The events emphasized reflection over spectacle, honoring the life lost, and acknowledging the work required to achieve justice. Ellen Delaney, Karen's sister, described the experience as both relieving and solemn. She expressed gratitude for the careful preservation of evidence and the persistence of law enforcement while acknowledging that closure does not erase loss. Her statements were shared with local press to document the ethical and human perspective surrounding the investigation. The Cold Case Task Force highlighted the successful use of forensic technology. The fingerprint, preserved for decades, demonstrated the value of detailed documentation, proper storage, and systematic investigation. Other families of missing persons were encouraged to submit evidence and records for reevaluation, reinforcing the long-term impact of diligence and patience in unresolved cases. Within Marlow Ridge, the case prompted subtle changes in community awareness. Residents became more attentive to minor irregularities and more willing to cooperate with investigations. Local law enforcement refined evidence preservation protocols and began integrating updated forensic practices into routine operations. These measures ensured that future investigations could benefit from the lessons learned in Karen Delaney's case. The story closed without sensational claims or dramatization. Instead, it emphasized persistence, careful record-keeping, and the ethical pursuit of truth. The combination of methodical investigation, modern technology, and sustained community attention created a resolution that, while not restorative of what was lost, provided clarity and accountability. Karen Delaney's case serves as a reminder that even decades-old mysteries can be resolved through precise evidence handling and technological advancement. The ripple effects extend beyond a single family, influencing investigative practices, community awareness, and the broader understanding of cold cases. The narrative concludes with recognition of both human and procedural perseverance. While Karen Delaney's absence remains a permanent loss, the integrity of the investigation, the ethical handling of evidence, and the respectful community response demonstrate the lasting impact of careful forensic work. The next story in the task force files begins with the same dedication to truth, prepared to illuminate questions that time once obscured.